Hi, grade sixes. Today we're going to be talking about another declaration. We've been talking a lot about the Convention on the Rights of a Child, and today we're going to be talking about another set of rights, and these are known as the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You'll hear me throughout the presentation refer to this as Undrip. This is because it's just kind of a mouthful to say all of that, and I'm going to be talking about it a lot. So if you hear me say Undrip, I'm referring to the rights of Indigenous people. So try to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. A quick review of last week's material is that we discussed that the rights of a child can be broken down into 4 sections. I'm not going to go through the specifics of those sections. If you're interested, you can go to last week's lesson. But mainly they're broken down into the right to survive, the right to be protected from harm, the right to develop to the fullest, the right to participate in family, cultural, and social life. And especially with that last one, participating in cultural and social life, you're going to see a little bit of a similarity between this, the rights of a child, and the rights we're going to be discussing today in terms of Indigenous people. And as we had mentioned before, it is an imperfect world, and many abuses against the rights of a child and the rights of Indigenous peoples still take place today. So before we start to discuss kind of the specifics of this document, we want to discuss first what I mean when I say Indigenous peoples. So usually when we think of Indigenous peoples, we think of people who we might typically call Aboriginal, Native, or the First Peoples. And there are actually 370 million Indigenous people living in 70 countries around the world. And they all have their own distinct language, culture, and beliefs. So we are talking about a lot of people when we discuss who this document would be affecting. So in 1985, this document was drafted by a group called the Working Group on Indigenous Population. They rallied and changed it quite a bit. Eventually, it was presented to the United Nations, who we had discussed previously, and the United Nations adapted this on September 13th, 2007. So this document contains 46 parts, or what we would call articles, and these different parts highlight rights and actions that governments must take to protect First Nations people. Now, similarly, as we discussed with rights of a child, the idea is that the governments in different countries would sign this right, the rights for Indigenous peoples, and by signing it, would be responsible to make sure that these rights were being fulfilled. Now, in 2007, many countries signed, and only 4 countries did not sign, one of which was actually Canada, who only signed this document and adopted it in 2016. And there were 2 reasons for this, and one of them will become more clear as we go through. The first one is that people argued that there was already a set of rights laid out for Indigenous peoples, and that was what we know as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's something that applies to all Canadians. So the argument was that that would also apply to Indigenous peoples, so a separate rights document wouldn't be necessary. The second argument was that there is a part in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks about something called free, prior, and informed consent, which I'm going to explain more later on in the presentation. And basically, people concerned that Indigenous people could reject certain types of use of the land that they lived on. And this would affect several economic projects in Canada, such as something we discussed in October when we talked about elections, the construction of a pipeline through several parcels of land in Canada, which would affect several Indigenous people in our country. So eventually in 2016 it was adopted, but we continue to see that Indigenous peoples in Canada are fighting for their rights and for their land even still. So in the attached video, I have a reading from In Our Hands, which discusses the fight for Indigenous rights more specifically. It talks about ways that people all over the world fight for Indigenous rights and what are some things that we could do. It also talks a little bit about Undrip, this document that the UN ratified, in 2007. So like the Convention on the Rights of a Child, Undrip is kind of the same in terms of that it's broken up into 4 main categories, and I'm going to explain each of them. The first one is right to self-determination. That means that there are different interpretations, and Indigenous people have the right to decide what's best for them in their communities. For example, they can make their own decisions on issues that concern them and carry out those decisions in a way that are meaningful to them, while being respectful of human rights of their community members, including children and other people as well. The second one is right to cultural identity. This basically just means that Indigenous people are equal to all other peoples, but they also have the right to be different, for example, in the way that they dress, the food that they eat, and in the language that they speak. Now, we mentioned this third one, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, when I discussed why Canada wasn't exactly ready to sign this document in 2007. What this right means is that Indigenous people have the right to be consulted and make decisions on any matter that may affect their rights freely, without pressure, and having all the information before anything happens. So this would have applied to land that they had owned because, of course, with the pipelines and other economic projects that were going to happen in Canada, obviously, if you've watched the news, many Indigenous people are against these pipelines being built because of the effects they would have on the environment. And as a result, that is why Canada hesitated to sign it until 2016. So right to free, prior, and informed consent means that all decisions that affect Indigenous peoples in Canada and or in any other country have to be talked about with Indigenous peoples in those countries first before a final decision is made. The last one is protection from discrimination. This basically means it's the right to be free from discrimination. The governments have to ensure that Indigenous people and individuals are treated the same way as other people, or regardless of disability, religion, or gender. So in looking at this document, you have to also understand that there is no international agreement. That means an agreement that's kind of an agreement that was made by everybody around the world on the definition of Indigenous people. We can kind of make our own definition and classify what we think this is, but people are allowed to do something that we call self-identify. And self-identify means that a person can decide whether they consider themselves to be Indigenous or not. So ultimately, the decision is left with that person. I know that's a lot of information to receive very quickly. So if you need to go back and rewatch the video to gain an understanding of Undrip or how it affects different Indigenous people in different countries, please do so. I will also attach the Undrip document. You won't need it to do the assignment, but maybe if you just want to look through it, it'll be there for you. So I have attached a Google Docs worksheet, and I just want you to answer some questions about Undrip and what we know about it. So I'm going to show you and read you the questions now. Most of the answers to these questions you should be able to find in the PowerPoint, so don't feel like you have to go and search on the internet. All the answers should be found in what we just did. So the first one, what does Undrip stand for? Which group drafted these rights? So which group originally created them and in what year? And a second part to that question is, when did the UN officially recognize these rights? The third question is, when did Canada adopt this agreement? And the date is written in there, in the slideshow. Number 4 is, what are the 4 main categories of the Undrip? And number 5 is, what is the definition of Indigenous people? So those questions can be completed right in the Google Doc, and you can just submit them to me when you're done. If you have any questions, please message me through the Google Classroom, comment on the assignment. You can send me an email message if you need to, and good luck, and we'll be chatting soon. Bye-bye.